So I'm going to transition us into the tour of Dig Deeper, which had we had the seminar in October, I would have done live for you and you would have gotten a nice live tour. But the exhibition closed about 2 months ago now, which I'm still sort of in mourning for. But before it closed, because we knew we wanted to do this, our amazing video team here filmed my tour instead. So we're going to watch that film of the tour to give you a little bit more of a sense of the space and how many of these things kind of came out in the exhibition itself. And then I'll be sticking around. There'll probably be about maybe 5 minutes at the end before our break, if there are any questions, or I'll be watching chat too. So if you want to chat me a question along the way, I'll be happy to answer it. So without further ado, here is past Kate giving a tour of Dig Deeper.
Hi, I'm Kate Larson, and I'm the Curator of Ancient Glass here at the Corning Museum of Glass. And I'm also the curator of the special exhibition, Dig Deeper, Discovering an Ancient Glass Workshop, which I'm really excited to share with you today. I like to think about Dig Deeper really as a homage to everything that the Corning Museum of Glass is and does. The Corning Museum was founded in 1951 as a gift of Corning Incorporated to the nation. And it was really founded on the principles of art, history, and science of glass altogether. My background is in archaeology. That's what I was before I started my work here at the Corning Museum as a curator. And archaeology, like the Corning Museum, is fundamentally really interdisciplinary, thinking about those twin pillars of art, history, and science together. So when I started thinking about what an exhibition could look like here at the museum, I was really attracted to those three things together. And I think you'll see that in the exhibition about how all three of those pieces come together. Another thing that's really exciting about this exhibition is that I was thinking about it, as I said, really as an homage to the museum. And it centers on the work that was done by a team from the Corning Museum of Glass and the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri, back in the 1960s. At that point in time, very little was known about how glass was made in the ancient world. And the Corning, Missouri team set out intentionally to ask questions that are still asked by visitors in our galleries today about how glass was made, what glass was made from, what did the furnaces look like, what tools did the glassmakers use, how did they shape the glass, how did they get the furnaces hot enough? These are all really important questions that we really try to answer in this exhibit in a really intentional way, using the material from this archaeological site that the Corning, Missouri team excavated in the 1960s. So the name of the site is called Jalame, and it's located in what's now northern Israel, just outside of the modern city of Haifa, at the foot of the Carmel Mountain region. So here you see it on a map where it occurs today. So the Corning, Missouri team set out in 1963 on an archaeological survey of the area throughout the modern country of Israel. And they went there in part because they knew from many ancient texts that Israel, the Levant, sort of Southwest Asia, was really a really important area for glass production in antiquity. So they knew they were likely to find something there, even though there hadn't really been a glass workshop that had been excavated there before. There had been things found that pointed to the existence of a massive glass industry there. So they surveyed, they found several sites, many of which went on to be excavated in the subsequent 60 years, but they picked Jalame because it seemed the most promising, and it was also located near some of the areas that were mentioned by those texts as being the sources for sand, and we'll see that in a little bit. So in antiquity, Jalame is the modern name of the site. We don't know what it was called in the ancient world. In antiquity, it was located in what was sort of the waning Roman Empire. The site's dated to the second part of the 4th century CE, so between about 350 and 400 or thereabouts. And this was a period in which the Roman Empire had split into two parts, the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire that was governed from the city of Constantinople, which is now Istanbul in Turkey. So the people who lived at Jalame and made glass at Jalame They weren't really ruled from Rome anymore. We don't really know how they would have identified themselves, if they would have called themselves Roman, but they're in this area that was in antiquity, this area that was called Palestine. So that's where we are located in sort of place and space. But as we go through and we talk more about the Jalame workshop, keep in mind that a lot of what we're talking about is really typical of the traditions of glassmaking throughout the first millennium CE. So I really think about the Jalame workshop as emblematic for what glassmaking was like for a long period of time, really broadly representing the Roman glassmaking tradition in the Eastern Mediterranean. So the first main space of the exhibition we call the Dig Jalame, and it really focuses on the excavation itself. And many of the things I just talked to you about why they went to Jalame, why they dug there, and what did they find. So these are the kinds of things that they found in that initial survey. Just pieces of glassmaking, pieces of glass debris, and the ways that they recorded it. We're guided through this section by the lead archaeologist from the University of Missouri on the project, Dr. Gladys Davidson Weinberg, who was a glass specialist who worked closely with the Corning, Missouri team. You'll also note several sort of themes starting to pop up throughout this part of the exhibition. One thing we did that was really unique for this installation was to really think about our youth and family visitors. So thinking about all the different ages of people who might visit this space. And we really wanted to target a wide variety and really give something for everyone. So you'll notice throughout that we have a lot of hands-on opportunities. So here we're showcasing archaeological tools, things that are used by archaeologists to really bring this to life, alongside our amazing graphic illustrations that were created by UK illustrator John Swager, and come in large part from the accompanying comic book for the exhibition. We also have here our first of our digital installations. We have this digital game that allows visitors to pick up an access pass and go through the process of conducting an archaeological excavation, of finding a glass object and studying it in a variety of different ways as they move through the exhibition space. So these are all kind of features that we'll see recurring throughout the exhibition. This area is really about highlighting the site itself and how the archaeologists found it. So some of our lending partners for this exhibition were the Israel Antiquities Authority, which still holds a lot of the material from the site, as well as the University of Missouri, which also holds many of the materials that were found during the excavations in the 1960s. So here we're showing several of the coins that were found at the site, which were used in dating the glass workshop period. And I especially love this gold coin, which still shows really amazing detail. So all these coins are dated to the second part of the 3rd century CE, which is the main reason we know that the site, the archaeological site was dated, or the glass workshop was dated to that period as well. And that's been verified by other excavations in the area and the type of glass that was found at the site. People often ask how you can date glass, if you can carbon date it or do any other kind of analytical technique, and we can't. So we're really reliant on things like this about what's found with the glass to be able to date it. And right next to it, we have a case that showcases some of these other principles that really underlie a lot of archaeological method, really thinking about how we know what we know about ancient glass. So this is a display that was built by one of our amazing preparators here at the museum, Isaac Hawley. And it's showing how different layers of soil show different ages of the deposits. So these are all things that I picked up locally in Corning, and kind of it's a little schematic concept of how things would have been buried over the years. If you were to dig down in your backyard in Corning, you'd find the newer things at the top, things like the COVID mask, which is immediately emblematic of 2020 and that experience that happened during the pandemic, going all the way back through cassette tapes, and then finally like much older materials that aren't like what we find today. So this principle is called stratigraphy, and it really helps archaeologists understand the relative chronology of things. So if we find different objects in different associations with other materials and are able to connect those with known dates, like from coins, we build up this vocabulary of dating of different pieces of glass and other archaeological materials. So This is actually the only intact piece that was found at Jalame, and we're showing it here with the different recording methods, which are also really critical in archaeology. And we wrap up this area by continuing the story with the excavations that are ongoing in the area. In 2015, the Israel Antiquities Authority was excavating at the base of the hill. The Jalame workshop that was excavated in the 60s is at the top of the hill. The Israel Antiquities Authority was excavating down at the bottom, and they found this series of 4 tank furnaces. These are primary glass-making furnaces, and you can see there's 1, 2, a corridor here, and then 3 in just the corner of the 4th one. And this really verified that this area was really important for making glass in antiquity at this point in time. And that's what we're going to go talk about next. Welcome to the Archaeology Lab. Our guide through this area is Dr. Robert Brill, who was the chief scientist of the Corning Museum for his entire career, for over 50 years, until he retired about 10 years ago. So Dr. Brill really led the scientific part of the Jalame excavations. And he was really charged with understanding the chemical composition of ancient glass and answering some of those questions about the materials. So here we have showcased the actual stuff that glass at Jalame was made out of. Sand from the Belus River, which was located just really a stone's throw away from the Jalame site. And you can see this image that was taken in 1963 of what that Belus River bed looked like. So this is a silica-rich sand, along with natron from Wadi Natrun, which is a location in Egypt that produces sodium, minerals, a kind of mineral sodium that is used to make glass. So Roman glass, the glass that was made at Jalame, is a typical soda-lime silicate mixture. And we have Roman authors like Pliny, who was writing in the 1st century CE, that says that glass was made from Belus River sand and natron, or a mineral sodium, from Wadi Natrun in Egypt. So Brill's studies of the glass from Jalame were actually the first to verify this experimentally. So Brill collected these materials and tested them and found that the compositions were consistent with the material that was found at Jalame, like these pieces here. And it was only later, much later, that we realized, in part due to those discoveries that the IAA made nearby, but that glass was also being made at Jalame in primary furnaces. So we talk about glass making in the ancient world as being divided into primary glass making, the sort of manufacture of glass from raw ingredients, like the natron salts and the Belus River sand. And then it's made in these like big tanks. So all those ingredients are mixed together in what we call primary furnaces. Here's another one of our great comic illustrations, and a large scale. So this is an even bigger one that we saw that the IAA found at the base of the Jalame Hill. Those were about 4 feet wide by 6 feet long, and they got bigger and bigger throughout antiquity. So those materials would have been mixed up and then fired in these furnaces for days or even weeks at a time to basically cook those materials together to form the glass. And then this entire superstructure was disassembled, was taken apart. So that's why one of the reasons we don't have really any of those that survive. We just have those foundations. And the glass, which would have been left behind in this big sort of slab, was then broken up into smaller pieces where it could then be shipped out or sold to glass workshops throughout the Mediterranean and the rest of the ancient world. So another question that people ask pretty regularly is how glass gets its color. So those basic ingredients that go into making glass, that sand and that mineral soda, create a lot of discoloration in the glass, like these blues and greens here. And that's actually we call that a naturally colored glass, and it's due to the iron that comes in, particularly with the sand, that reacts in the furnace and gives it these really beautiful blue hues, green hues, and then brown if it ends up if that burning environment is a reducing environment, meaning there's not a lot of free oxygen available. So these are all, if you tested each of these pieces, you'd basically find them to have similar compositions. There's not different colorants or anything in them. It's all due to the presence of the iron in the glass. So what do you do to get a colorless glass or to get a more deeply, richly colored glass? In that case, you add some more mineral oxides or metallic oxides to the glass. So things like copper, which will give you a really rich, darker blue. You can also add a cobalt oxide, or manganese. So manganese is one of the most popular colorants that was used in the Roman world. And in different sort of concentrations and through different permutations, manganese will either give you this sort of purplish color, or it will even decolorize your glass. So it'll give you a colorless glass that counteracts the effects of the iron. So those are some of the ways that the glassmakers at Jalame and elsewhere in the first millennium CE colored their glasses. We also talk about weathering in this area. Weathering is what happens to the surface of the glass after it's been buried in soil or in a moist environment for centuries or thousands of years. It's a kind of, people often wonder about the iridescence or the discoloration, some of this kind of brown or creamy weathering that they might see on the surface of ancient glass. And it didn't look like that when it was originally made. That's all part of the decomposition of the glass itself. And if we were to remove it, we'd actually be destroying the glass. So we'd lose some of these really amazing surface details. So this is something, and people like much later, like Tiffany and company, will work really hard to emulate some of these surface effects, like the iridescence, that they really admired in these ancient glasses. But they weren't that way in antiquity. They were really just would have looked like fresh, clean glass, like what you would use today. And it's only due to the age and the chemical interaction of the glass with the salts and the water that it's buried in that gives it that look. This entire wall showcases fragments of glass vessels that were found in the Jalame excavations, alongside intact pieces from our collection and that were found at nearby sites in Israel, on loan to us from the Israel Antiquities Authority. So this was really one of the things that I felt was the heart of the exhibition, to showcase the way that fragmentary material is really important to understanding the nature of what's being made at Jalame, and helps us to really understand pieces in our museum collection that we don't necessarily always have a lot of information about. So by showcasing like these different little fragments, you can look really carefully and see that the foot and the rim of these beakers match really closely to a piece like this that's in our collection that we don't have a lot of information about. But if you go over to our permanent exhibition area, and you'll see that a piece like this would have a label that says made between 350 and 400 in ancient Palestine, you might wonder how we know that, when all we really have about that specific piece is that it came from a collector in New York City and entered the museum's collection in the 1960s. Well, the reason we're able to give a date and a location to where we think that piece would have been made and used is because we find similar materials from archaeological sites that show these forms. Even though they're fragmentary, they give us a lot of really important information. We were also able to create a replica wood burning furnace that our amazing hot glass team built in the summer of 2022 to start to help us understand how these pieces might have been made in antiquity. So the video at the center of this area shows the way that, different ways that these vessels might have been manufactured using the same kinds of tools and techniques that were available to the glassblowers at Jalame. So now we're in the workshop area, and this section of the exhibition really talks about the glassblowing techniques that were used at Jalame. So when Gladys Weinberg and the other archaeologists who excavated the site in the 60s, when they got there, they found all this kinds of material, like you see scattered in front of me, that were littered across the site. And they knew it was connected to glassmaking in some way, but they weren't exactly sure how it would have been used. They were used to finding fragments of vessels and other kinds of broken things that were utilitarian, that were being used by people, and knew that these were waste products, but didn't understand how to interpret them. Remember, they're the first ones who had ever really paid attention to excavating a glass workshop. And they weren't familiar with even basic things about glassblowing that we really kind of take for granted today about our state of knowledge. So Gladys Weinberg happened to meet up with Dominic Labino in Toledo in the late 1960s. Dominic Labino, as you probably are aware, was an early figure in the studio glass movement, and as part of the studio glass movement was really interested in thinking about ways to make glass on a smaller scale, so more like what would have been done in antiquity. At the same time, Gladys Weinberg and the archaeologists were trying to figure out how glass would have been made in the ancient world. So when Weinberg showed some of the things that they were finding at Jalame to Labino, he immediately knew what they were. He immediately recognized them from the kinds of byproducts that he was making in his own workshop. So he was immediately able to point out things like these large chunks here that look kind of like glass and kind of like not glass. And what those are is that they're actually part of the wall of the furnace where the glass has eaten into the side of whatever is trying to contain it. Hot glass is incredibly corrosive, and glass furnaces, even today, usually don't last more than 5 to 10 years or so. And that's about how long we think that the Jalame workshop operated, in part because the furnace might have failed, had the same problems that we have with modern furnaces, and it would have needed to be replaced. And all kinds of other evidence points to the fact that this workshop was only active for a relatively short period of time, and that pattern is consistent with glass workshops that we find throughout the rest of the region as well. And what we think is happening is that we have semi-itinerant glassworkers who are moving essentially from site to site, building new furnaces, probably locating different fuel sources. That's something we don't talk about in this exhibition, but we talk about in our Get Stoked exhibition, which is a partner to this one, about how important fuel use is in glassmaking throughout history. So the Jalame workshop would have been pretty short-lived, and the kinds of things that they're finding there are really similar to what's being produced by glassblowers even today. So this case gives a little bit more detailed view of some of that glass blowing debris that Labino helped Weinberg identify from the site. And in this case, we have things like moils, which are these circular pieces here, which, again, Weinberg didn't know what they were when she first found them. And they're clear evidence we now recognize them as clear evidence of glass blowing taking place at the site. What these are, and we have a great series of videos over here that show how this works, is the moil is the part that connects the pipe, the glass blowing pipe, to the vessel that's being shaped. And then after the vessel gets cracked off and put in the annealer, that moil gets discarded with the other glassblowing waste, and you can imagine it's this sort of cylinder. And by looking at these really carefully, we can learn all kinds of really interesting and important things about the way the glass workshop operated. So this little dark fleck in this particular moil is a piece of iron scale. And that's how we know that the glassblowers were using iron blowpipes, because that iron flaked off into the glass. This was the part of the glass that was in contact with the blowpipe. And that might have been one of the reasons why these weren't recycled or remelted, is because the glass workers recognized that higher levels of iron would further contaminate their glass, and they tried to keep it pretty pristine. Another really nice little detail from these moils is that some of them have this sort of cracking pattern on them. That's what happens to hot glass when it's submerged in water. It gets all these microfractures in it. So you'll still see glassblowers do this today. They'll take the end of their blowpipe and they'll just dump it in a bucket of water to help cool down the glass more quickly and allow them to break that moil off the end of the blowpipe. The exact same thing they were doing at Jalame. So it's a really nice connection between ancient and modern manufacturing methods. All these other pieces are other further remnants of the glassblowing process. And the other one that I'll point out right now is these little ones that look kind of like tadpoles. With a thin end and a thick end. And for decades, these people didn't know exactly what these were. These are not the kind of thing that's produced in modern glass workshops. And it was only in the 2000s when experimental glass makers began working in a wood-fueled furnace environment and began making some of these replica furnaces that they discovered that wood-burning furnaces sort of shoot off all kinds of ash and debris. The furnace itself will break off and pieces will fall into your crucible of molten glass. So you end up with a little bit of crud in your glass gather. And what these are is the glassmaker cleaning the gather. After they gather up the glass, they're taking out those little bits and pieces and just sort of pulling them out and discarding them. So you get these little tadpole-shaped pieces of glass debris. So there weren't really many tools, really any tools that were found at the Jalame workshop site, largely because they were probably metal, which would have been remelted or would have been taken with the glassmakers when they left, or would have been made of wood, which would have deteriorated and doesn't survive for over 1,500 years. The one tool that does survive, we're really excited to have on loan to us from Israel, is this little bitty knob right here. And what it is the end of a pontile rod that has glass stuck to the end of it. And probably the glassmakers discarded it because it did have that contamination from the glass. They just broke off the end and threw it away on site. So we're really fortunate to have that. So the final stop on our exhibition tour today is in the marketplace zone of the exhibition. So the marketplace zone really talks about what happens to the glass after it leaves the workshop site, or the archaeological site. So in both antiquity and today. So one of the things we talk about is the way glass was actually used. So all those sort of utilitarian, common, everyday wares that were being made by the Jalame glassblowers, many of them ended up in homes, in cities, domestic contexts, particularly within a small regional area within maybe 30 to 50 miles or so from the workshop. It was really supplying a fairly small market, along with a few other workshops. And many of those pieces eventually did end up in burial assemblages, in graves that are found in the area. So we were able to borrow from Israel an entire grave assemblage that showcases many of the kinds of glass that would have been made, of the types that were made at Jalame, alongside other materials that occur with the glass, that are buried alongside the glass, like spindle whorls, glass beads, and really nice examples of some gold and silver jewelry. The fun thing about some of these products is that they're wasters. They're a little bit off. They might not have had the perfect kind of market value. They might not have been usable, but they were still considered to be appropriate for use in burial assemblages. So the concept of burial is not exactly like the Egyptian concept. These aren't necessarily things for use in the afterlife by the deceased, but would have been used as part of the funeral itself, the funerary rites, either for feasts or dedications, perfumes, that sort of thing that are buried alongside the deceased. We also talk a little bit in this area about sort of the market for glass, that primary glass workshop. Remember back in the lab zone, I talked about the way glass was made in these large tank furnaces at Jalame. There's glass that matches the Jalame compositions that's been found as far away as Italy, the Western Mediterranean, and even Britain. So the Jalame workshop and others like it were blowing glass for that more local or regional audience, but then they were also making glass itself and sending it out throughout the Mediterranean world and even further into North Africa and Northern Europe to supply the glass blowers in those areas as well. So the final stop in our exhibition tour is a contemporary artwork by Palestinian artist and designer Dima Srouji. Dima was forced to leave her home in the West Bank in the early 2000s and due to ongoing violence in the region and flee with her family. And she ended up in London, where she would visit museums, and like the British Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, that had glass collections like ours, and was really struck by the fact that many of these glass objects, like her, were displaced from their homelands. one of her trips back to visit family in the occupied West Bank, she discovered that there was still ongoing glassmaking in the area, and really wanted to come up with ways to keep the vitality of that tradition of that manufacturing technology going. So she created a production line called Hollow Forms, and the pieces in this case are called ghosts, and there's some of the examples from that production line that are made by the Twam family, who are glassworkers who are based in Jaba in the occupied West Bank. So the Twams primarily make borosilicate labware to supply local Palestinian universities. And DEMA has commissioned them to create replicas of ancient glass vessels like the ones in our collection and that she saw in those other museums. And she really thinks about these objects as being echoes, ghosts, remnants that are left behind after all these artifacts have been removed from the place from which they originated, just like she herself was. And we displayed them on this really lush purple velvet in consultation with Dima herself. And purple is the color of mourning to the Palestinian people. So there's really a sort of a sadness as well as a beauty to these pieces that have been disconnected from the places that they come from. And we really felt like it was the right kind of artwork and message to really put some of the Jalame finds and the ongoing kind of museum practice as well as archaeological practice into context and connect it with the ongoing nature of these traditions, the importance of the glass industry in this part of the world for millennia, and to celebrate the ongoing vitality of that tradition. So that's Dig Deeper. Thanks for joining me, and take care.
Okay, question. Thank you, Janet. Do you know how big the cullet or chunks would have been that they shipped from the furnace? Well, we do have some shipwreck sites that Yael mentioned yesterday that do have some of those chunks, and they're mostly pretty small, kind of fist-sized or maybe a little bit bigger, not very large. I think the biggest chunk of cullet I've seen of raw glass from antiquity in these, maybe one of these kind of transshipment areas, was actually from Tarha, which is a site that Kathleen Slane mentioned yesterday, where it's, not like maybe a foot, 2 feet long and yay big. I mean, still not massive. You may have noticed in some of the photos we've been showing at the exhibition, there's a massive piece of glass that weighs 1,000 pounds that was at the center of the exhibition, kind of was our grounding point in the middle, which is not actually an ancient piece of glass. And in fact, the label for it was, why is this big piece of glass here? And we were really clear that it wasn't ancient, but we wanted something that would kind of ground the space and be really a strong visual attractor and give us a little bit of a sense of scale, because so much of the other material was so small. So probably, yeah, they would have been fairly small pieces that were sent for use in other glass workshops. Oh, and yeah, I was saying for up to 15 kilograms. Thank you. Thanks, Yael. And how they might have smashed up the big slabs. Some of it would have just happened sort of as the glass was cooling, that it was cooled, as Yael mentioned yesterday, it was cooled fairly quickly. And so, that annealing process of glass, it would have just fractured automatically. So that would have caused some of the breakage. And then you could have just used a hammer, chisel, basic equipment to break it up into some smaller pieces. There's another question that I'm not sure I entirely understand. Are the Corning pieces on display? I'm assuming you mean the pieces that have been in Corning that came from the site. So not now, since we closed the exhibition, and that's all off view. One day we were able to retain some of the pieces from Jalame here in Corning on long-term loan. And I would love at some point in time, maybe in the next year or so, to put a more permanent installation of the Jalame material and tell that story in our permanent galleries in a little bit more fixed way. But right now we're sort of like in recovery mode from the temporary exhibition. So yeah, at some point in time. All right. So I'll do a little bit of a verbal narration for the part we didn't get to in the rest of the workshop. So one of them, what I was probably about to talk about in the tour, and I'm sorry you don't get to see it, is our display case that featured many of the small fragments of the glassblowing waste that were found at the site, and how we had videos that documented them from the wood-fired furnace, which you'll see actually in a half an hour or so. We've got our hot glass team coming on. And looking really carefully at a lot of those fragments to learn what we could about ancient glassblowing. And I would always point out on my tours, in the moils, there's often a little bit of a dark spot, which we know from chemical studies and other reasons is actually a little bit of iron scale that's flaked off onto the glass. And so when we say we know that their blowpipes were made of iron, even though, as we discussed yesterday, blowpipes tend not to survive in the archaeological record because they get remelted. Glassblowers take them from place to place. As Alicia mentioned this morning, like they're sort of making the Syrian glassblower who was making do with whatever he kind of could find around to make his own tools. But that's how we know that the primary material they were using to make their blowpipes was iron, because of those like little bits of iron scale that are present in the moils. I also went through and I measured a lot of the moils from Jalame. We have easily over 1,000 that were here in Corning, and I kind of documented a little over 500 of them kind of at random. And it seems that there's 2, maybe 3 diameters of blowpipe they were using. One that's in sort of, and they're really pretty small compared to what a modern glassblower would use. One that was sort of in the range of 1 to 1.5 centimeters, and one that was around kind of 1.8 to 2 centimeters or so. That seemed to be that blowpipe diameter that they were using. So by looking really carefully at these little fragmentary bits, we can really kind of learn some real concrete things about the activities of those glass makers. And then the final zone that I would have wrapped up in is that marketplace zone, which included Dima Surji's work, as well as the burial material from Haifa, and talked in general about the sort of distribution of glass in antiquity and today. But again, those of you who've been along on this journey with us for the last day and a half will have kind of gotten a little bit of a sense of that already, and some of the use of some of these containers and so on, or the material made at Jalame. And I think I don't know that anybody's really said it specifically. So the Jalame workshop is primary workshop, making raw glass, secondary workshop, making glass vessels. We know through the blowing debris, and that raw glass is going out, widely through the Mediterranean, North Africa, into northern parts of Europe, and perhaps even Britain. But the vessels they're blowing at the site are much more limited in their distribution for really a regional market. So they're really supplying a more local clientele, a local customer. And these materials are mostly like they're basic blown vessels, they're utilitarian shapes, with the exception of those very few examples we have, mostly in the raw material waste of purple or like that little tiny bit of colorless that we were talking about yesterday with Ian and Gree. They're mostly making natural colored glasses, so it's not an extra added expense. It's that sort of lower quality Judean glass and fairly basic forms. So really intended for kind of middle class levels of consumption. And dining service, table services, and then oftentimes they end up in burial assemblages. So it appears that, again, I apologize that our video of the tour did cut off, and I can't show you the rest of the space, but if there's any other questions, feel free to place them in the Q&A. Otherwise, well, it's been a long bit of time, and I want to give everybody a little bit of a break. But do be back here. Can kind of just mute us, stay in the room, and we'll be back at the top of the hour at 3 o'clock Eastern time to hear from our hear from our hot glass team who built that wood furnace and kind of got to dive into their own kind of experimental archaeology themselves. They're going to be talking about that process in more detail and what they learned from it from the perspective of being glass blowers. So with that, I will leave you. You'll see me again later. Thank you, everyone. See you at 3.